The moment Lenora Rosenfeld pressed her palm to Nikolai Volkov's chest and said, "He is under my protection," every vampire in the Grand Conclave chamber went absolutely still, not the careful stillness of politicians choosing their words. The ancient, predatory stillness of creatures who had not expected a human to say anything so catastrophically brave in the 300 years since the Conclave's founding. Duchess Seraphine, with her white hair coiled into silver ropes and her crimson gown pooling on the marble like spilled blood, tilted her head at an angle that was not quite human. Her pale lips curled. "You," she said softly, "are a healer. Healers are neutral. That is the blood law." "I am aware of what the blood law says." Lenora did not move her hand from Nikolai's chest. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her fingers, slower than a human's, but present, steady, and right now the most important sound in her world. "I am also aware that you had 3 assassins waiting behind that curtain before this session began, which tells me the Conclave was never interested in a trial. You intended an execution." The murmur that ran through the assembled vampire houses was enormous, a tide of whispers in a dozen old languages. Lenora did not look away from Seraphine. Nikolai Volkov, prince of the Volkov bloodline, one of the oldest and most dangerous vampires to walk a world that still largely pretended his kind did not exist, placed his hand over hers on his chest. His fingers were cool, long, and precise, and he looked down at her with silver-white eyes that contained something she had never seen in them before tonight. Something that frightened her more than Seraphine's 3 assassins. He was afraid, not for himself, for her. "Lenora," he said, and his voice was so quiet it was almost private. "What have you done?" "Something I should have done 6 months ago," she said. She finally turned to face him fully, "and the whole conclave be damned. I am declaring for you, Nikolai. Publicly, formally, by whatever clause of the blood law applies. I am your declared healer. Not the conclave's. Yours." The silence that followed was the most dangerous silence Lenora had ever stood inside, and then Duchess Seraphine smiled. And it was the kind of smile that meant someone had just made a very costly mistake, and Seraphine was delighted to collect on it. 6 months earlier, Lenora had been living a manageable life. She ran a private medical practice on the 42nd floor of a building in the center of the city that had 2 categories of patients. During daylight hours, she saw ordinary people with ordinary ailments, and she was good at it, and she cared about it deeply. After sundown, she saw vampires. This was not common knowledge. The arrangement had been brokered through the Conclave's Human Liaison Office 3 years ago. When it had become apparent that vampires integrated into modern urban society at increasing rates were occasionally injured, occasionally needed medical expertise that did not involve being drained in a basement somewhere, and that the Conclave's own blood physicians, brilliant as they were, operated according to protocols that were several centuries out of date. Lenora had been recruited because of her combination of emergency trauma training, documented discretion, and what the liaison officer had described, with admirable understatement, as an unusual calm around people who frightened most humans. She had agreed because the work was fascinating, the pay was extraordinary, and she had a stubbornness about her that made her deeply resistant to being told. There were things she could not handle. The neutrality clause had been explained to her with great seriousness by 3 different conclave representatives on 3 separate occasions. A declared healer was sacrosanct. To harm a healer was to break blood law so fundamentally that even the oldest houses would move against the offender. In exchange for that protection, a healer served no house, no lord, no bloodline. A healer healed everyone, equally. Without preference or political alliance. It was a good system, and Lenora had believed in it genuinely for the first 2 years. Then she had met Nikolai Volkov, and the system had begun to develop complications. He had arrived in her clinic on a Thursday night in January, which had surprised her, because she had been told the Volkov prince did not use human services. He had arrived with a wound along his left side that told her he had been attacked by something that had coated its weapon in silver, which was a brutal thing to do to a vampire, because silver did not merely cut. It disrupted the cellular regeneration that made vampires so difficult to kill. Without intervention, the wound would not close properly, and the contamination would spread. He had stood in her examination room wearing a charcoal coat that cost more than her car, with white hair worn loose to his jaw. and pale skin that had the particular quality of fine porcelain in good light. And he had looked at her with those silver-white eyes and said, with the tone of someone who found the entire situation mildly insulting, "I am told you are competent." "I am," Lenora had said, snapping on her gloves. "Take off the coat and sit down." He had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had done it. Later, she would think that was the moment it started, not for her, but for him. The moment a woman had told Nikolai Volkov what to do, and he had simply done it because her competence was apparent and he respected competence above almost everything else. She had spent an hour cleaning the silver from the wound. Using a chelation protocol she had developed specifically for this kind of injury, talking while she worked, because she found that patients, human and vampire alike, stayed calmer when spoken to, and because silence made her feel like she was performing surgery in a tomb. She had asked him about the silver, about who had done it, about whether he had other injuries she should know about. He had answered every question, which had also surprised her later, when she understood more about what he was. Nikolai Volkov did not explain himself to people. He made decisions, and other people accommodated them, and that was the order of things in his world. But he had answered her questions, and by the time she finished dressing the wound, he had been watching her with an expression she could not quite name, and had not thought about too deeply, because she had been exhausted and he had been her last patient. "You will need to come back in 48 hours, she had said, stripping off the gloves. "The chelation needs a second pass." "I will arrange it," he said. "Not arrange it. Come yourself. I need to monitor the tissue response, not receive a report from an intermediary." Another long pause, another decision made behind those extraordinary eyes. Very well, he had come back. And then he had come back for a follow-up that was medically unnecessary, which she had noted and not commented on. And then there had been a vampire 3 houses below Volkov rank who had come to her clinic bleeding badly from a political confrontation that had turned physical. And when she had finished with him, she had found Nikolai in her waiting room, reading something on his phone with the focused expression of someone who was pretending to be less interested in what was happening in the next room than he was. She had stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. "You were making sure he didn't hurt me during treatment." "He has a temper," Nikolai said, not looking up. "It seemed prudent to be nearby. I had it handled, I know. I watched the door the entire time and it remained closed, which means you had it handled. But I was nearby in case you did not." Something had shifted in her chest at that, small and stubborn, like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. She had gone and made coffee because she was a practical person, and she did not stand around examining feelings when there was something useful to be done. Over the following months, Nikolai had been nearby with increasing frequency and decreasing pretense. He brought her information about patients she was about to see, warning her of volatile temperaments or concealed conditions she might not find on intake forms. He appeared at her clinic door late on nights when the city's vampire politics had been particularly turbulent, not to be treated, but she understood now to make sure she was safe. He argued with her about her security arrangements with the kind of focused energy that told her he had spent time thinking about her vulnerabilities in the abstract, which was deeply unsettling, and also she had admitted to herself alone in her apartment at 2 a.m, deeply touching. She had learned things about him in exchange, that he was 340 years old and remembered a world without electricity, but that he did not romanticize it because he was too practical a person to romanticize anything inconvenient, that he ran the Volkov bloodline with the kind of precision and care that his enemies mistook for coldness, that he had an older sister, Vasilisa, who was warmer and funnier and more socially successful than he was, and whom he loved with a ferocity he would never describe aloud, but that was apparent in the way he said her name. That he had killed people, yes, because he was 340 years old and had survived every bloody decade of those years, but that he applied the same code of honor to that as to everything else, never arbitrarily, never casually, and always with a clarity of purpose that he extended to every other decision in his life. That code of honor was what had made her trust him. Not his beauty, not the gravitational pull of those silver-white eyes, not the particular quality of his voice when he said her name, though she would have been lying to pretend those things were not present. It was that in 6 months of knowing him, Nikolai Volkov had never once deceived her, manipulated her, or made her feel that her choices were not her own. The vampire world was full of people who did all three, and she treated them too, because neutrality meant neutrality. But she knew the difference, the problem. The enormous and now apparently catastrophic problem was that the Conclave had begun to know the difference too. Duchess Seraphine led the 3 oldest houses in the current Conclave coalition. A woman of extraordinary age and political genius who had spent 2 centuries consolidating power in the vampire court through a combination of strategic marriages, artfully manufactured crises, and the elimination of anyone who threatened the balance she had constructed. Nikolai represented the one bloodline that could not be absorbed into that coalition. Because the Volkov line was older than Seraphine's, and had a claim to the Conclave's highest seat that Seraphine could not match, Lenora had understood this intellectually. She had not understood how immediately dangerous it was until 3 weeks ago, when a vampire named Casimir, a thin, precise man who worked for Seraphine's house as a political secretary, had come to her clinic late at night with an injury to his hand that was minor enough that she had wondered, while treating it, why he had come at all. He had told her, at the end of the appointment, in a tone of careful neutrality that matched nothing in his eyes, that the Conclave had noticed she seemed to have formed a particular familiarity with the Volkov household. That this familiarity was being discussed in certain circles. That as a declared neutral healer, she might wish to consider whether her social calendar was creating the impression of a preference that, under blood law, could be used to challenge both her neutrality and the Volkov prince's standing. He had smiled when he finished, the smile of someone delivering a warning wrapped in a threat, wrapped in a courtesy, and he had left. Lenora had sat alone in her clinic, for a long time afterward, thinking. She was very good at thinking clearly when other people might panic, which was perhaps the most essential quality for an emergency physician. She laid out the facts. Seraphine was positioning to use the neutrality clause as a weapon. If Lenora's association with Nikolai could be characterized as a political preference, then Nikolai could be accused of corrupting a neutral party, which under blood law was a serious offense that could be used to strip a house of its conclave standing and expose its prince to formal censure. The polite word for whatever a vampire court did to princes, it wanted to neutralize permanently. The obvious solution was to distance herself from Nikolai publicly and immediately. She had thought about it seriously for a long time, because she was an honest person and she gave due weight to solutions she did not want to use. She had concluded that it would not work for 2 reasons. First, Seraphine had already decided to move against the Volkov line, and removing Lenora from the equation would simply cause Seraphine to find another pretext. The accusation would still come, just through a different door. Second, and this was the part she had spent the longest time examining in the privacy of her own honesty, she did not want to do it. She was not willing to withdraw the declaration of care that she had been making quietly for 6 months under the cover of professional neutrality, because that declaration was real, and pretending it was not was a lie she did not know how to tell. She had gone to Nikolai. She had gone to his apartment, which occupied the entire top floor of a building he owned in the old part of the city, and she had told him about Casimir's visit, and she had watched his expression do something very controlled and very cold at the mention of Casimir's name, and then he had turned away from her and stood at the window that looked over the city's nighttime lights with his hands clasped behind his back for a long time. "You should have come to me immediately," he said finally. "I came to you as soon as I had thought it through clearly enough to be useful," she said. "I am here now." He turned back and looked at her, and she saw that the cold in his expression had shifted to something more complicated. "Lenora, I need you to understand what they will do. If Seraphine tables a neutrality challenge against your practice, she does not simply end your affiliation with the Conclave. A healer who breaks the neutrality blood law has no protection. You become, in their law, a partisan. A partisan who has been operating inside vampire society with access to sensitive medical information on every house that has used your clinic. I understand. They will not simply end your practice. They will move to eliminate you. I understand that too." His jaw tightened. Then you understand why you must create distance between us. Immediately and publicly, I will ensure that Seraphine sees it. I will arrange an apparent political disagreement, something visible and credible. She will accept it and turn her attention elsewhere, at least long enough for me to deal with the actual threat. And if I refuse to do that? The question landed in the room like something physical. He looked at her with those silver-white eyes, and she saw something move in them. Something he was holding back with the same deliberate control he applied to everything. You cannot refuse, he said quietly. It is the logical course of action. I know it is, she said. I also know that Seraphine has already decided to move against your house, and that removing me from the equation does not change that. What I am telling you is that I think you have been fighting this defensively for too long, and I think what you actually need is not for me to disappear, but for the situation to be reframed entirely. Reframed. If I declare for you publicly, formally under the clause of the blood law that allows a healer to surrender neutral standing by voluntary declaration of alliance, then Seraphine cannot use my neutrality as a weapon, because there is no neutrality left to weaponize. She loses the pretext. He went very still, and you lose your protection. Under the neutrality clause, yes, but under the alliance clause of the same law, a declared healer partisan of a major house has the protection of that house's blood law standing. It is an older clause. Seraphine will not be expecting it. You have been reading the blood law. I have been reading it for 2 weeks. The clause exists. It has not been invoked in over 100 years, but it exists and it is valid. Lenora. He crossed the room, and he stood close enough that she could see the careful precision of how he was holding himself, the effort it took to not reach for her. You would be declaring yourself my partisan. Publicly, before the conclave. Do you understand what that means, socially, politically, for your career in the human world? For every relationship you have built on the premise of your neutrality? Yes, she said simply. I understand exactly what it means, and you are willing to do it. I am willing to do it for you, she said, and she said it plainly, because she was not a person who dressed difficult truths in decorative language. Not only because it is the strategically logical option, though it is, but because you have been standing near my door for 6 months, making sure I was safe, and I think it is time I stood somewhere near yours. The expression that moved across his face then was one she had never seen on him before. It was not composure. It was the brief, involuntary dissolution of composure. The thing underneath. He reached out and took her hand, holding it with a carefulness that was almost painful to look at. There are other options, he said, but his voice had changed. I could move you out of the city. I have resources, safe locations. I could ensure your practice continued under different circumstances in a different place, while I resolved the conclave matter through other means. You could, she agreed. But you would still be facing Seraphine without resolving the core vulnerability in your standing, and I would be in a safe location somewhere being correctly furious about having been removed from my own life for my own protection. Is that what you want? A pause, and then, unexpectedly, almost unbearably, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close, the closest thing to it she had seen on him in 6 months. No, he said, it is not what I want. Then let me do this. There was a long silence, and she watched him make the decision she could see him fighting, the one where he stopped trying to solve her safety as a problem he could manage alone and allowed her to be a partner in solving it instead. The conclave session is in 3 days, he said. I know. Seraphine will table the neutrality challenge the moment the session opens. She will have documentation, witnesses, probably testimony from Casimir about his visit to your clinic. I know that too. If you walk into that chamber with me and declare formally before she has the chance to table the challenge, she loses the procedural ground. The alliance clause supersedes the neutrality challenge. It is older law. Older law takes precedence in conclave proceedings. I read that too. Another movement at the corner of his mouth, warmer this time. You are extraordinarily well prepared for someone who 3 weeks ago did not know blood law existed. I am a physician. I read technical literature quickly and I retain it. Also, I was motivated, Lenora. He said her name the way he had said it in the conclave chamber later, the way that made it sound like something he had been keeping safe for a long time. If this goes wrong, I will not be able to protect you inside that chamber without triggering a broader conflict. The declaration protects you under law, but law requires the Conclave to honor it, and Seraphine controls 3 of the 7 houses. I know the risk. I need you to know it with all of it in view, not the version that sounds manageable. She met his gaze directly. I am looking at all of it. I am still here. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and so careful that her chest ached with it. Then we go together, he said. In 3 days, they had gone together. And now she was standing in the conclave chamber with her hand on his chest, and Duchess Seraphine, smiling the smile of someone rearranging a trap, and the most dangerous moment of Lenora's life was only now beginning. Seraphine spoke to the assembled conclave with the precision of someone who had been preparing this exact argument for longer than Lenora had been alive. Yes, she acknowledged, the ancient alliance clause existed. Yes. Technically it predated, and therefore superseded the neutrality challenge she had intended to bring. How interesting that the healer had studied enough blood law to find it, and how interesting that the Volkov prince had access to a healer capable of doing so. But the alliance clause, Seraphine said, moving through the chamber with a grace that was genuinely beautiful and genuinely terrifying, has a condition that the healer cannot have met, because she was not aware of it until a moment ago. A declared healer partisan must be formally bonded under blood law to the house she declares it for, not symbolically, not professionally, a blood bond. Given freely, witnessed by the conclave, unbreakable except by death. The murmur that went through the chamber was different this time. Darker. Lenora kept her face still. She had not read that part. She had not found that condition. Seraphine had known she would not, because the condition had been written into the alliance clause 2 centuries ago as an amendment, and was buried in language that made it easy to overlook. She felt Nikolai's hand tighten over hers. Seraphine, he said, and his voice had gone to the register that Lenora had heard once before, when a junior vampire from another house had made a remark he should not have made in her direction. The register that was not a shout, but was considerably more frightening than one. A blood bond cannot be compelled. That is also blood law, indeed, Seraphine said pleasantly, which is why I am not compelling it. I am simply noting that without it, the alliance clause is incomplete, and therefore the neutrality challenge proceeds. Unless, of course, the healer consents. Every eye in the chamber moved to Lenora. She understood the trap completely now. A blood bond was permanent. If she consented, she was bound to the Volkov house by a supernatural tie that could not be dissolved. If she refused, the alliance clause collapsed, the neutrality challenge proceeded, and she lost the legal protection that was the entire point of having come here. Seraphine had not lost the ground at all. She had simply shifted it. Lenora looked at Nikolai. His expression was a controlled catastrophe. He was working through the same logic she was at the same speed, and arriving at the same place, and the thing she could see in his face that he was not managing to hide was that the idea of asking her to consent to something permanent and supernatural and irrevocable was something he would rather die than do under the conditions. Don't, she said quietly, for him alone. Lenora, don't apologize, don't tell me to refuse, don't start calculating how to get me out of here, because I know that face and I know what it means. She turned back to Seraphine. Tell me what the blood bond requires. Seraphine looked delighted. A willing offering of blood, witnessed by the full conclave, from the healer to the house's prince. A drop is sufficient. The prince accepts it and the bond is sealed. The healer becomes formally house partisan, protected under the Volkov blood law standing, permanent until death dissolves it. And is there anything in the condition that specifies the healer must be anything other than willing? Any limitation on who can consent? A slight narrowing of Seraphine's pale eyes. No, then I consent. The chamber exploded. Multiple vampires speaking at once, a sound like a breaking wave, and beneath it Nikolai, taking her arm gently and turning her to face him. Lenora. His voice was completely even, but his eyes were not. I need you to understand that this is permanent. A blood bond does not end if you change your mind in a year. It does not end if you find that life in the borderlands between human and vampire society is not what you thought. It does not end except when you die, and given that you are human, that will be sooner than you'd like, she finished. I know. Something moved across his face, raw and immediate. "Yes," he said, "sooner than I would like." "Then we are wasting time we don't have," she said. "And I have already thought this through, Nikolai, the same way I think everything through. Completely, with all of it in view. Ask me again if you want. I will give you the same answer." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had not expected. He took her face in both his hands, cool and careful, and he said, very quietly, "For the record, if this were only about strategy, I would have found another way. I want you to know that." Her heart did something complicated. "I know," she said. "I have wanted to say that for approximately 5 months and 3 days. I know that too." She put her hands over his. "We can talk about it afterward. Right now we have an audience and a blood law to satisfy." He lowered his hands and turned back to the conclave. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the chamber with the particular resonance of 3 centuries of command. "The House of Volkov accepts the healer Lenora Rosenfeld's declaration. We will proceed under the Alliance Clause. Witness." She gave her blood, a small cut on her palm, offered and accepted. A ritual so old its original language was dead in the human world. And then it was done, and the conclave could not pretend otherwise. Seraphine's expression told Lenora that this was not over. Of course it was not over. Losing a procedural battle to a human healer who had read blood law for 2 weeks was not something a woman like Seraphine would absorb and step back from. This was the opening move of a conflict, and Lenora knew it. But the session could not proceed with the neutrality challenge after a valid alliance declaration, and Seraphine's coalition was not yet ready to move against the Volkov house openly. They needed a pretext, and Lenora had just burned the one they had. The session was adjourned. The chamber began to empty with the careful, measured movement of very old creatures who had learned not to move quickly in political situations. Lenora stood beside Nikolai, and his hand had moved to the small of her back, not possessive, protective, the particular geometry of someone positioning themselves between a person they cared about and everything in the room that could threaten them. Vasilisa Volkov found them near the chamber's eastern door. She was everything Nikolai had described and more, his sister, a vampire of 302 years with white hair cut, sharp at the jaw and warm silver eyes that held a perpetual undercurrent of sharp humor. She looked at Lenora, and then at her brother, and then back at Lenora. "You," she said, "are either the bravest human I have met in a century or the most strategically inventive." "Both," Nikolai said. "Both," Vasilisa agreed, and then she did something that clearly surprised her brother, because his hand shifted slightly against Lenora's back. She took Lenora's hand and held it briefly, not a handshake, something more deliberate. "Welcome to the family," she said. "I mean that quite literally under blood law, and I also mean it in every other way. My brother has been impossible to live with for 5 months. I am glad we have finally resolved the cause." "Vasilisa," Nikolai said, with a warning note that had absolutely no effect. 3 separate occasions, she said to Lenora cheerfully, in which he rearranged his entire evening schedule for no stated reason and arrived back at a reasonable hour in an inexplicably better mood. "I am very good at reading patterns." "I will deal with you later," Nikolai told her. "You will try," she said affectionately, and then her expression shifted, because she was also, clearly, her brother's sister, and beneath the warmth there was a steel that matched his. Seraphine spoke to Marius before she left, the Duskavar house representative. They were brief and private, and I could not hear the content. But Marius left through the south passage, which means he was heading for the old city. "That is faster than I expected," Nikolai said. "She lost ground publicly. She will want to recover it privately and quickly." Vasilisa glanced at Lenora. "The blood bond is formal and sealed. Seraphine cannot challenge it procedurally, but she may move to challenge it by other means. Meaning she might try to dissolve the bond by removing one of the parties," Lenora said. Vasilisa looked at her with an expression that had shifted to something respectful. "Precisely. Then we need to not be predictable about where we are tonight," Lenora said, "and we need to reach out to the 4 houses that are not in Seraphine's coalition before Seraphine's people reach them first." A pause. Then Vasilisa said to her brother, "I approve of her very much." "So noted," Nikolai said. "Lenora, you are coming with me. Vasilisa, take the south route and reach Aldrich of the Thornville house before midnight. Tell him what happened today and tell him the Volkov line is formally requesting conversation about coalition building. He has never liked Seraphine's consolidation, and today gives him reason to act on that. And the other three. I will send Petir and Serena. He was already moving, his hand shifting from Lenora's back to her hand, and she went with him because the decision was already obvious. They had a window of hours before Seraphine's next move, and windows in the vampire court closed fast. They went out through a passage in the Conclave building's lower level that surfaced in the basement of what appeared to be an ordinary office building 2 blocks away. Lenora had not known this passage existed until Nikolai led her through it, which told her there were still dimensions of his world she was navigating with incomplete maps, a fact she filed to address later when there was time. Outside, the city was doing what cities did at 10 o'clock on a weeknight, moving with the particular energy of people who had somewhere to be. Lenora stood on the sidewalk and breathed the cold air and thought about what had just happened to her life. Blood bonded to a vampire prince, formally, permanently before the oldest supernatural court in the country. Her practice would change, her life would change in ways she was probably still underestimating. She had done it entirely on purpose and without coercion and with her eyes open, and she would do it again. "You are very quiet," Nikolai said beside her. He was watching the street with the scanning attention of someone who was never fully relaxed in open spaces after dark, particularly not tonight. "I am processing. Tell me what you are processing. The number of ways my life is different now compared to this morning. Is it worse?" She looked at him. The city lights caught the white of his hair, and his profile against the night sky was the profile of someone who had looked at 3 centuries of the world and refused to be diminished by any of it. The blood bond was a physical sensation she had not expected, a warmth in her palm where the cut had been, as if something had settled into place there. "No," she said honestly. "It is not worse. It is more complicated and more dangerous, and I will need to restructure my practice and have several very difficult conversations with human colleagues. And I will probably need to read approximately 400 more pages of blood law in the next 2 weeks. But it is not worse." Something in him eased, very slightly, not visibly to anyone who did not know what to look for. Lenora knew what to look for. "Good," he said simply. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes, 5 months and 3 days. Were you counting?" A pause, and then he did smile, fully and unexpectedly, and it transformed his face into something that stopped her breath. "I was not counting. I remembered the specific night. It was a Tuesday, the first Tuesday in August. And you had finished treating a patient from the Havenmore house, and you came out of the examination room, and you said something about the inefficiency of vampire healing biology with such specific irritation that I found it, somehow, the funniest thing I had heard in approximately 40 years. "I remember that night," she said. "You laughed. I had never heard you laugh before. I had not found occasion to for some time. And that was the night? That was the night." He looked at her, and the directness of it was everything she had come to associate with him. Not performance, not flattery, just truth. "I am not practiced at this," he said. "I want you to know that. What I am, what I have been for 300 years, has not often included the particular experience of once wanting someone to be safe because I care about them, rather than because they are politically useful. I am not always going to do it gracefully. I am not very graceful about it either," she admitted. "I tend to convert feelings into action plans. I noticed that you noticed." She exhaled. We should move. We have a window." "We do," he agreed. But he did not move immediately. He lifted her hand, the one that bore the warmth of the blood bond, and held it for a moment. "When this is over," he said, "and Seraphine's coalition has been dealt with, and the Conclave is stable, I want to have a conversation. About what? About what this means, what we are. What I want to ask you, if you are willing to be asked." Her heart did the complicated thing again, and this time she let it. "When this is over," she said, "I am very willing to be asked." They moved. The next 72 hours were the most intense of Lenora's life, which was saying something significant. Nikolai moved through the crisis with the efficiency of someone who had survived centuries of vampire politics and knew exactly how to apply pressure at the points that mattered. Lenora stayed with him through all of it, not as a passive observer but as a working partner, because there were things she could do that he could not. She could cross lines in the human world and the vampire world simultaneously, a mobility that was genuinely useful when 2 of the 4 coalition potential houses had significant human business interests that needed parallel management. She reached out to the Thornvale and Morvain houses through Vasilisa, presenting the Volkov coalition offer with the clarity and specificity of someone accustomed to presenting complex medical options, laying out the exact benefits, the exact risks, the exact alternative if they declined. Both houses were traditional enough to be skeptical of a human healer speaking for a vampire prince, and modern enough to recognize that the skepticism was costing them more than it was protecting them. Seraphine made her countermove on the second night. It came not through the conclave but through something older and less formal, a challenge delivered to Nikolai directly by a representative of the Duskavar house, which was Marius's house, the one Vasilisa had seen Seraphine's consulting. The challenge was personal rather than political, a formal declaration of intent to contest the Volkov house's conclave standing by force of arms, which was an old-world mechanism that had essentially meant a confrontation at a time and place of the challenged party's choosing. Lenora looked at the formal challenge document, which had been delivered on paper in a language she needed Vasilisa to translate, and said, "He wants Nikolai to fight him." "It is the oldest form of house dispute resolution," Vasilisa said. "Seraphine knows the procedural options are closed now. She is going to the mechanism that predates procedure. If Nikolai agrees to the challenge and wins, what happens to Seraphine's coalition? Marius's house withdraws from the coalition without Marius. The remaining 2 houses are insufficient to hold the blocking majority Seraphine needs. Her position collapses, and if Nikolai refuses the challenge, refusal is tantamount to conceding the house dispute. It is not an option." Lenora had gone to find Nikolai. He was in the library of the Volkov apartment, which was a room she had come to think of as his most honest space. Floor-to-ceiling shelving and a desk that bore the organized archaeology of 3 centuries of accumulated paperwork, books in 6 languages, maps, the careful tools of a mind that never stopped working. He was reading the challenge document with an expression that was absolutely composed and absolutely resolved. "I know," she said from the doorway. "I was going to tell you. I know that too. I got here first." She came in and sat across from his desk. "Marius, what do I need to know about him?" Nikolai set the document down and looked at her. "He is old, 160 years, which is not old by the oldest standards, but old enough. He is fast. He is not subtle about his power, which is a weakness. He relies on overwhelming force rather than strategy. And you, I am faster," he said. And then, because he was who he was, "I am also older and more experienced. I am not telling you I will definitely win, Lenora. I am telling you I believe I will, and I believe it because I am assessing the factors clearly rather than hoping." "I know," she said. "What do you need from me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Nothing. You have already done the most important thing. The coalition is nearly assembled. 3 of the 4 houses have agreed in principle to the counter-coalition. If the challenge resolves tonight, Seraphine is finished politically. Everything you did in the last 2 days is the reason that is true. Then go do your part," she said, "and come back." The instruction was simple, and the feeling behind it was not simple at all. He stood and came around the desk and stood before her with that particular quality of presence he had, the sense of something very large and very old choosing to be careful. "I intend to," he said, "Nikolai." She stood too, and she was close to him, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw the way she had been wanting to do for approximately 5 months. "Come back." He turned his face into her palm for just a moment, the briefest and most unguarded thing she had seen from him. "Yes, yes," he said. "The challenge took place in the old city, in a space beneath one of the ancient buildings that had been used for this purpose long before the city above it had existed." Lenora was not permitted to be present for the challenge itself under the formal rules. But Vasilisa was, as house witness, and she brought Lenora to a room adjacent to the challenge space where she could hear but not intervene. Listening to the sounds of a formal vampire confrontation and not being able to do anything was the most difficult thing Lenora had done, and she had done a great many difficult things. She sat in the adjacent room and, controlled her breathing, and counted the minutes, and reminded herself of every careful, precise thing Nikolai had ever done in her presence, the evidence of who he was and what he was capable of. It was over in less than 30 minutes. Vasilisa came to get her, and she could read the outcome in Vasilisa's expression before a word was said. Nikolai was standing in the challenge space, unmarked save for a cut across the back of his hand that was already closing. Marius was seated against the far wall, being attended by his house second, not dead, but finished in every way that mattered in vampire politics. A vampire who accepted a challenge and lost it did not challenge again. It was an absolute law of the old world. Lenora crossed the room and stood in front of Nikolai, and looked him over with the physician's eye before she did anything else. Because she was a healer first and everything else second, and he watched her do it with an expression that she recognized now as his version of being moved. "The hand," she said. "It is closing. I can see that. I want to check the depth regardless. Lenora, hold still." He held still. She examined the cut with a small light from her phone, cleaned it efficiently with the kit she carried in her bag, because she always had a kit because she was always a physician. And when she finished, she held his hand in both of hers for a moment that was not medical at all. "Good," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. His free hand came to rest in her hair, briefly, the way something might settle when it had been unsettled for a long time. The political resolution followed the challenge resolution with a speed that would have seemed startling if Lenora had not understood by now that the vampire court moved in absolute stillness until it moved all at once. With Marius's house effectively withdrawn from Seraphine's coalition, the remaining two houses recalculated their positions with the speed of creatures whose survival instincts were well calibrated. Both sent representatives to Nikolai within 4 hours of the challenge's conclusion. Seraphine herself appeared at the Volkov apartment building at just past 3 in the morning, a visit that was announced rather than surprise. Because Seraphine was nothing if not a brilliant reader of the field, and she had read this one correctly. The ground had shifted beneath her coalition, and she had come to negotiate rather than continue a war she could not currently win. Lenora sat in on the conversation which she suspected Seraphine had not expected. The Duchess arrived with 2 members of her house, and looked at Lenora with the assessment of someone recalibrating against new information. "The healer," she said. "House partisan now, not merely house adjacent, Lenora Rosenfeld," Nikolai said, and there was something particular in the way he said it, not a correction, not a clarification, a declaration, my partner, in all contexts. Seraphine absorbed this. She was, whatever else, a realist, and realists did not waste energy fighting ground that was already lost. "I will acknowledge that the procedural strategy was overextended," she said, with the smoothness of someone who had been making tactical concessions for 2 centuries. "The Volkov house has a stronger coalition position than my initial assessment suggested. I am prepared to discuss a realignment of coalition terms." "You are prepared to discuss conceding the blocking majority," Nikolai said, a pause very brief. "Yes, and you are prepared to publicly acknowledge the Volkov house's conclave standing without qualification." Another pause, fractionally longer. "Yes, then we can discuss terms," Nikolai said, and the negotiation that followed was a masterclass in the kind of precise, controlled power that had nothing to do with volume or threats and everything to do with clarity. Lenora watched it and was, she admitted privately, somewhat awed by him, even having spent 6 months in proximity to this quality of mind. It took 2 more hours and produced an agreement that Seraphine would not love but would honor, because it was in her interest to honor it, and self-interest was the most reliable guarantee in the vampire world. When Seraphine left, Vasilisa appeared from the adjacent room she had been occupying with remarkable patience and said, "That went better than I expected." "It went as expected," Nikolai said. "I had planned for this contingency. You had planned for Seraphine conceding within 48 hours of a failed challenge. I had planned for several scenarios. This was among the more favorable." Vasilisa looked at Lenora. "He is impossible," she said fondly. "He is consistent," Lenora said. "I find it useful, actually." Vasilisa laughed, and it was a warm sound in the room that had been full of very tense political maneuvering for 2 hours. And Nikolai looked at both of them with the expression of someone who was outnumbered and not particularly unhappy about it. The days that followed were different from anything Lenora had experienced in 3 years of working in the borderlands, between the human world and the vampire world. The formal blood bond changed things in ways she had anticipated and in ways she had not. The anticipated changes were practical: new security arrangements for the clinic, formal notification to the Conclave's liaison office, the quiet renegotiation of her patient agreements to reflect her partisan status. Several vampire patients from houses allied with Seraphine discontinued their relationship with her practice, which she had expected, and 3 of them came back within 2 weeks, which she had also expected, because she was very good at her work, and good medicine was difficult to replace, even when politics argued for it. The unanticipated changes were more personal. The blood bond was a physical phenomenon, subtle but present, a warmth in her palm that corresponded to Nikolai's proximity, something that faded at distance and strengthened when he was near. She had asked him about it one morning, with the directness she applied to everything. "Can you feel it?" she asked. "From your side?" He was at the window of the library. The city was beginning to lighten toward dawn, which was the time of day he was most present in the apartment, before the need to avoid direct sunlight became more pressing. He turned and looked at her, and his expression was one she was learning to read now, the various textures of his composure. "Yes," he said. "I feel it. What does it feel like?" A pause that was not avoidance but consideration. "Like knowing," he said finally, "that you are there, that you are well, a kind of certainty I had not had before." She absorbed that. "Is it uncomfortable?" "No," he held her gaze. "Is it, for you?" "No," she said honestly. "It feels like an anchor, which is strange because I am not someone who usually needs anchoring." "Perhaps it is not about needing it," he said. "Perhaps it is simply accurate information. You are anchored here, and so am I." She looked at him across the library, at this 340-year-old creature who had survived everything the centuries had constructed against him, who was precise and careful and quietly funny when he allowed himself to be, who stood near doors and checked street-facing windows and had rearranged his evening schedule on 3 occasions to make sure she was safe, who had looked at her in the conclave chamber, with his composure coming apart at the edges because she had put herself in danger for him. "You said you wanted to have a conversation," she said. When this was over, something changed in the room, not dramatically, but completely. He was still standing at the window, but the quality of his attention shifted the way it did when something mattered to him. "I did say that," he said. "This is over, or close enough. The coalition is stable. Seraphine has conceded the blocking majority. The conclave has formally acknowledged the alliance clause. We are as resolved as we are going to be for the foreseeable future." She met his gaze across the room. So, he came away from the window. He moved the way he always moved, with a fluid, inevitable quality. And he stopped in front of her, close, the way he had been close in those moments before the challenge when she had put her hand against his jaw. "I have been alive for 340 years, he said. "In that time, I have made every decision with the same instrument I make all decisions, which is careful analysis of available information and the most logical course of action given that information. I am very good at it. I have made very few mistakes." "I know," she said. "The only significant error in my decision-making in the past 6 months was not telling you immediately what you had become to me. I kept rationalizing it as prudence, as protecting your neutrality, as protecting you from the complications of my world. All of those things were true, and none of them were the real reason." "What was the real reason?" "The real reason," he said, with the particular steadiness of someone telling a difficult truth he has made peace with, "was that I was not prepared for what it felt like. To want someone not as a political ally, or a useful resource, or a pleasant companion, but as a person whose continued existence in the world is more important to me than almost any other factor. That is an unusual state for me. I did not know how to manage it gracefully." "You managed it," she said, poorly. "No, carefully." "There is a difference." She reached for his hand. "What did you want to ask me?" He turned her hand over in his, looking at it, and she saw the precise moment when he decided to simply say it. "I want to ask you whether you want this to continue. Not the blood bond, which is what it is, and is not under discussion. Not the partnership in the conclave context, or the professional arrangement. I am asking whether you want this." He looked up from her hand to her face. Me. Whatever that means in practical terms, given every difference between us, including the one where you will age and I will not, which I know is not a small consideration. I am asking with all of that in view. The word he did not use, the word that was nevertheless completely present in every syllable, hung between them. You're asking if I love you, she said. I am asking if you want to build something with me, he said. The other word is one I intend to say to you in different circumstances than a library, at 5 in the morning, after 2 of the most difficult days of your life. Different circumstances, like what? Like somewhere that is not here. Somewhere without political crisis, as the ambient atmosphere. Somewhere I have had time to do this properly. You are planning something, she said. I am always planning something. But in this case, yes, something specific. She looked at him and felt the warmth of the blood bond in her palm, and the warmth of something else entirely in her chest, the 5 months and 3 days accumulation of knowing this person, this impossible, careful, ancient, honorable, occasionally exasperating person, who had stood near her door and made her laugh for the first time in years and held her hand in the conclave chamber, with the carefulness of someone who understood the weight of what they were holding. Yes, she said. To your question, whatever you were actually asking. Yes. He pulled her forward, both hands at her face, and he kissed her with all the precision and intention he brought to everything he did, and she kissed him back with everything she had brought into that conclave chamber, all the bravery and the stubbornness and the 5 months of careful honesty that had built, without her fully marking the moment, into something that felt like the most important decision of her life. When they separated, he said close to her face, I am going to tell you properly. When I have arranged the circumstances. I am aware, she said. I want to do this correctly, Nikolai. She put her hand flat against his chest again, but different from the conclave chamber, different from anything professional or strategic. Just her hand on his chest and his heartbeat under her palm. You have been doing this correctly for 6 months, from the moment you came back for a follow-up appointment that was medically unnecessary. He was quiet for a moment. You knew it was unnecessary. Of course I knew. I am an excellent physician. And you said nothing. I was curious what you would do next. Something in his expression went warm, the particular warmth that was his version of being completely undone by her. And what was your conclusion? He asked. That whatever you were going to do next, I wanted to see it, she said. The circumstances he had planned for turned out to be 3 weeks later. On a night when the city was quiet and the conclave was in one of its calmer phases, and Vasilisa had been conspicuously absent from the apartment for the entire evening, which Lenora suspected was not coincidental, Nikolai took her to the roof of the Volkov building, which she had not been to before, and which was not the standard building rooftop of ventilation equipment and urban bleakness but a garden. A real one, carefully designed, with things growing in containers that should not have survived at this altitude, and lights strung in patterns that suggested someone had spent a great deal of time thinking about how light moved. Vasilisa helped, he said, before she could ask. Your sister has good taste. She has her own taste, which happens to align with what I told her I wanted for tonight. She was very pleased to be consulted. He said this with the faint, fond exasperation of an older sibling. She is going to need a full account tomorrow, and I intend to give her the version that takes the longest to tell. Lenora laughed, genuinely, the full kind of laugh that still sometimes surprised her in his presence. The reminder that, whatever else he was funny in this quiet, precise way that crept up on her. He looked at her when she laughed the way he had looked at her that first Tuesday in August, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on it. Lenora, he said. Yes, I have been alive for 340 years. In that time, I have learned most of what a person can learn about power, about survival, about the long game of existing in a world that does not always make room for you. I am very good at those things. What I was not good at, until approximately 5 months and 3 days ago, was being known. She was very still. You know me, he said. Not the prince of the Volkov house, not the political operator or the strategic mind or the creature that frightens people. You know the person who reads until dawn because he cannot stop and rearranges his schedule, because he needs to know someone is safe and has not laughed genuinely in 40 years. and finds it somewhat embarrassing how much has changed in him in 6 months because of one person. He held her gaze. "I love you, Lenora. That is what I wanted to say properly. I love you, and I am asking if you will let this be what it already is." She could feel the blood bond warm in her palm and every careful, intentional, extraordinary day of the past 6 months in her memory, and she was a practical person who converted feelings into action plans. But she was also a person who knew when the most important action available was simply to say the true thing. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since August, at least. Possibly since January, when you came in with a silver wound and told me I was told you were competent in the tone of someone who found being impressed mildly insulting." "I was impressed immediately," he said. "I was not prepared to be impressed, and I handled it badly." "You handled it exactly like yourself," she said, "which is why it worked." He took both her hands carefully, and he did the thing she had learned to watch for. The thing he did when something moved him past the point of composure he maintained. The thing where the 3 centuries of controlled precision gave way for just a moment to something that was entirely and recognizably human in its vulnerability. He held her hands and just looked at her, and the look said everything the words had already said, and more besides. "I do not know how much time we have," he said. "Given the difference between us, I will not pretend that is not a real weight." "Neither will I," she said. "But I have never made decisions based on time running out. I make them based on what is true right now, with everything in view." "And what is true right now?" "That I am exactly where I want to be," she said. "With exactly the person I want to be with. And I intend to be here for every day that is available to me, and I am not going to spend any of them managing the distance between us or treating it as a problem. Because the alternative to accepting it is to not have this, and that is not a trade I am willing to make." He kissed her then, or she kissed him, the distinction no longer particularly relevant. On a rooftop garden, above a city that did not know it contained the headquarters of an ancient vampire court, under lights that someone had strung with care, with the blood bond warm between their clasped hands and 340 years of careful survival on one side, and 32 years of brilliant, stubborn, open-eyed living on the other. And it was, Lenora thought, the most complete moment she had ever stood inside. In the month that followed, the life they built together was not simple, but it was theirs, which was the more important quality. Lenora restructured her practice around her new status with a thoroughness that impressed even the most procedurally minded members of the Conclave. She expanded rather than contracted, because she was Lenora Rosenfeld, and the instinct to find the larger challenge was simply part of how she was built. She hired 2 additional practitioners who could cover the daylight hours, freeing her to extend her vampire practice, and she established a formal protocol for the bloodlaw documentation that her cases now required, which she wrote in consultation with Nikolai, and which the Conclave Liaison Office adopted as a model for future healer-partisan arrangements. The political landscape shifted over those months in ways that confirmed the gamble had been worth the cost. Seraphine's coalition, deprived of its blocking majority, was forced to negotiate rather than dictate, and the negotiations produced a more balanced distribution of conclave influence than had existed in decades. Not peace, exactly, because the vampire court did not really do peace in any simple sense, but balance, which was the functional equivalent. Several houses that had been quietly waiting for the Seraphine coalition to overreach emerged from their caution and began participating more actively in conclave proceedings, which changed the character of the court in ways that Vasilisa, who had her own considerable political gifts, described as overdue. Vasilisa herself became a regular presence in Lenora's life in ways that she had not fully anticipated and was entirely glad of. Nikolai's sister was the most entertaining person she had met in years, possessed of the same underlying precision as her brother, but wrapped in a social warmth that made her devastatingly effective in contexts where Nikolai's directness was a liability. They became, over those months, genuinely and deeply friends, the kind of friendship that had nothing to do with obligation or political utility and everything to do with mutual recognition. One evening, approximately 9 months after the conclave session that had changed everything, Lenora came home to the Volkov apartment which she had been sharing with Nikolai long enough that she no longer thought of it as his apartment with her things in it, but simply as home, and she found Vasilisa sitting in the library with an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and failing. "He is on the roof," Vasilisa said. "I live here," Lenora said. "I know where things are. He has been on the roof for 2 hours. He has been planning something for 3 weeks, and I have been excellently discreet about it, and I need credit for that discretion." Lenora looked at her for a moment. "You helped with something." "I helped with several things," Vasilisa said, with great dignity. "None of which I will spoil. Please go up." The roof garden had changed with the seasons, different things growing now, and the lights were in a different configuration from the last time, warmer, closer together. Nikolai was standing at the garden's edge looking at the city, and he turned when she came through the door with the same attentiveness he always turned with, the 3 centuries of survival instinct version of knowing exactly where she was. He was, she thought, objectively beautiful. The way certain things were beautiful in the sense of being precisely what they were with no apology for it. White-haired and pale-skinned and silver-eyed and ancient and hers, which was still a thought that settled over her with a warmth she had not gotten accustomed to and did not want to. "Vasilisa told you nothing specific," he said, reading her face as he always did. "She told me to come up and take for her for discretion. She has not been discreet. She has mentioned approximately 5 times this week that she was helping with something and being discreet about it. She is very proud of herself." "She is," he agreed warmly. "Come here." She went. He took her hands and the blood bond was warm and the night city was lit below them, and he looked at her with the look that she would never get accustomed to, the one that contained 3 centuries of precise, careful existence, and a person who had been known, finally, fully, by one other person. "I want to ask you something," he said. She recognized the opening. "You asked me something 9 months ago on this roof. I asked you to let this be what it was," he said. "You said yes, I am asking something more specific now." She was very still. "I want to ask you to remain mine," he said. And the word was exact, not possessive in the diminishing sense, but the old word for reciprocal claiming, for belonging that went both directions. Formally, permanently, in whatever terms make that true for both of us. She looked at him for a long moment, at this impossible, extraordinary, careful, ancient, deeply honorable person who stood near her doors and told her the truth even when it was complicated, and laughed at her precise medical irritations and rearranged centuries of solo survival to make room for partnership with someone who would, by every temporal measure, leave before he did. "You know my answer," she said. "I know what I hope your answer is," he said. "I want to hear it." "Yes," she said, the word the same as it had been 9 months ago and as certain. "In whatever terms, permanently. I am yours and you are mine, and I said yes to that the moment I pressed my hand to your chest in the conclave chamber. I just did not have the right word for it yet." He brought her hands to his lips. The same gesture he had used in her clinic a year ago that had undone something in her chest. And then he pulled her into his arms, and she went, and the city sprawled below them, full of ordinary people and extraordinary secrets, and a vampire court that had learned, reluctantly, that a human healer with 2 weeks of blood law reading and 1 act of extraordinary bravery could shift the balance of centuries-old politics. Vasilisa appeared in the doorway to the roof approximately 4 minutes later, did not even attempt to pretend she had not been waiting, and said, "Well, yes," Lenora said. Vasilisa made a sound of profound satisfaction. "I helped," she said, "to no one in particular, and everyone in the universe." "You did," Nikolai agreed, and when he said it, he was looking at Lenora. And the word meant something layered and specific, not just tonight, not just the lights on the rooftop, but all of it, the year of it. The careful accumulation of trust and danger and honesty and care that had built, 1 Tuesday in August and 1 Thursday in January, and 1 devastating moment in a conclave chamber at a time into this. They stayed on the roof until nearly dawn, which was the particular measure of a good night between them, until the sky began to change, and Nikolai's attention shifted to it with the ancient biological knowledge of exactly how much time he had. And they went inside together the way they did everything now, without ceremony, without drama, just the natural movement of 2 people for whom the most extraordinary thing about their life was also the most ordinary thing in it. The conclave continued. Seraphine's coalition continued to negotiate rather than dictate, which was its own kind of victory. Vasilisa became one of the most effective political operators in the court's modern history, which surprised everyone who had underestimated her warmth as softness, which was their mistake. Lenora's practice grew. Her human colleagues eventually, on the whole, accepted the change in her status, though several needed multiple conversations to make peace with the concept of a vampire court operating under their city, which she had facilitated with the same clear, patient communication she applied to all difficult information. The blood bond aged with her in ways she had not expected, not diminishing but deepening. The warmth in her palm more familiar with each year, like learning to read a language that had always been in her body. Nikolai watched her the way she had known from the beginning he would, with the full weight of someone who understood what finite time looked like when laid alongside infinite life, and she watched him with the clear eyes of someone who had never made a decision by looking away from the hard parts of it. It was enough. It was, in all the ways that mattered, more than enough. It was everything. And somewhere in the Conclave's records, filed under the Alliance Clause of the Blood Law, in the careful script of the Chamber's formal secretary, was the document that began it all. The declaration of one human healer who had studied blood law for 2 weeks and walked into the most dangerous room in the vampire world and placed her hand on a prince's chest and changed everything that came after. Everyone had assumed she was neutral. She had decided, finally and completely, that she was not, and the decision had made all the difference.